James Carville leaned forward in his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on the camera. He was sitting in a brightly lit studio, surrounded by the buzz of producers adjusting microphones and checking sound levels. The topic of the day was as controversial as ever: immigration. Carville, known for his fiery style and unfiltered opinions, didn't hold back. With his signature Louisiana drawl, he launched into a passionate critique of former President Donald Trump and his wife, Melania. They talk about immigration like it's some kind of moral failing, Carville said, his voice rising with each word. But look at their own lives. They've hired people from other countries to work in their homes, their businesses. How do you square that with their tough-on-immigration stance? It just doesn't add up. The host of the show nodded along, clearly enjoying the energy Carville brought to the table. The audience, watching from home, was split. Some cheered him on, agreeing wholeheartedly with his take. Others rolled their eyes, dismissing his words as another example of partisan mudslinging. But no matter where people stood, one thing was clear: Carville had struck a nerve. As the segment wrapped up, Carville sat back, satisfied with his performance. He always thrived in these moments, knowing he could command attention and provoke reactions. What he didn't realize, though, was that this wasn't going to be a one-sided conversation. Across the country, someone was already preparing to push back, and they weren't going to pull any punches. That someone was Michael Leavitt, a Republican strategist who had spent years working behind the scenes. Unlike Carville, Leavitt wasn't a household name. He preferred staying out of the limelight, focusing instead on crafting strategies and shaping policies. But when he saw Carville's comments, something inside him snapped. He felt the accusations were unfair, even hypocritical, and he knew he couldn't let them slide. Leavitt spent the rest of the day gathering information. He combed through public records, news articles, and official statements, piecing together a detailed response. By the time he went to bed that night, he had a plan. The next morning, he woke up early, dressed in a crisp suit, and headed to a nearby studio. He had been invited to appear on a popular morning talk show, and he intended to make the most of it. When Leavitt walked onto the set, he looked calm and collected. The host greeted him warmly and quickly brought up Carville's remarks. "So, Michael, what's your take on James Carville's comments about the Trumps?" she asked, leaning in slightly. Leavitt smiled politely before responding. "Well, I think it's important to separate fact from fiction here," he began, his tone measured but firm. "Yes, the Trumps have employed individuals from other countries, but there's nothing unusual or hypocritical about that. Millions of Americans do the same thing. The key difference is that the Trumps followed the law. They filed the necessary paperwork, paid the required taxes, and ensured everything was above board." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then, pulling out a folder, he continued. "Let me show you something." He held up a document. "This is a copy of the visa application for one of the employees in question. As you can see, it's all there in black and white. Every step was taken legally. Now compare that to some of the accusations being thrown around. It's just not accurate." The host raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "But what about the broader issue? Some people feel that hiring foreign workers contradicts their stance on tightening borders." Leavitt nodded thoughtfully. "It's a fair question," he admitted, "but we need to remember that immigration policy isn't about banning all foreign workers. It's about creating a system that works for everyone, protecting jobs for Americans while also allowing businesses to function. The Trumps' actions reflect that balance. They're not breaking any rules. They're following them to the letter." As Leavitt spoke, viewers at home started paying closer attention. Social media lit up with reactions. Some praised his calm demeanor and thorough preparation. Others dismissed him as just another defender of the Trumps. But regardless of where people stood, they couldn't deny that Leavitt had presented a compelling counterargument. By the end of the interview, the narrative had shifted. Leavitt hadn't just responded to Carville's accusations. He had reframed the entire conversation. Instead of focusing solely on personalities, he highlighted the importance of facts and context. And while Carville had relied on emotion and broad strokes, Leavitt came armed with specifics. As the cameras cut away and the show moved on to its next segment, Leavitt took a deep breath. He hadn't planned on becoming the center of attention, but now that he was, he knew he had to keep going. This wasn't just about defending the Trumps anymore. It was about proving that thoughtful, well-researched arguments still mattered in a world dominated by soundbites and sensationalism. Little did Leavitt know his response would spark a chain reaction. Across the nation, people were talking, not just about what he had said, but about how he had said it. And somewhere in Louisiana, James Carville was watching, feeling a mix of frustration and admiration. Something told him this wasn't over yet. The ripple effect of Michael Leavitt's response was immediate and undeniable. By mid-morning, social media platforms were flooded with reactions to his calm yet pointed rebuttal. Clips from his interview went viral, shared by everyone from casual viewers to political analysts. Some praised him for bringing facts into what often felt like a fact-free zone. Others accused him of cherry-picking information to defend the Trumps. But love him or hate him, no one could ignore the impact he'd made. James Carville, meanwhile, wasn't taking it lightly. Back in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, he sat in his home office, scrolling through Twitter while sipping a cup of coffee. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, texts, emails, mentions, all pointing to the same thing. People were talking about Leavitt's takedown. At first, Carville tried to brush it off. "He's just another guy trying to spin the truth," he muttered to himself. But deep down, he knew this wasn't an ordinary situation. Leavitt had struck a nerve, and worse, he had done it without losing his cool. Carville decided to address the issue head-on during a late-night appearance on a popular talk show. The host, known for his sharp wit and ability to draw out candid responses, wasted no time bringing up Leavitt's name. "So, James, we've got to talk about this," he said with a grin. "Michael Leavitt came out swinging yesterday. What do you think?" Carville leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. For a moment, he looked like he was weighing his words carefully, a rarity for someone who usually spoke without hesitation. "Look," he began, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I respect anyone who wants to have a debate. That's fine. But let's be clear. This isn't about me or him. It's about holding people accountable." The host nodded, encouraging him to go on. "But doesn't it bother you that so many people are praising Leavitt for his approach? He seems to have really resonated with folks." Carville hesitated again, something uncharacteristic for a man known for his quick comebacks. Finally, he said, "Listen, I'll admit the guy did his homework. You can't fault him for that. But let's not pretend that facts alone solve everything. Sometimes you need to call things out for what they are, even if it makes people uncomfortable." The audience clapped politely, but the tension in the room was palpable. The host pressed further, playing clips of Leavitt's interview and asking Carville to respond directly to some of his points. As the segment wore on, it became clear that Carville was struggling. His usual confidence seemed shaken, replaced by moments of awkward silence as he fumbled for answers. At one point, he even admitted, "Okay, maybe I oversimplified a few things, but my overall point still stands." It was a rare moment of vulnerability for Carville, and viewers ate it up. Social media exploded with memes and commentary about how Leavitt had left the legendary strategist speechless. Some celebrated it as a win for thoughtful discourse. Others saw it as proof that even the best debaters could stumble when faced with solid evidence. Meanwhile, Leavitt watched the interview from his living room in Virginia. He wasn't gloating. In fact, he almost seemed uneasy about the attention. Turning to his wife, he said, "I didn't mean to make this personal. I just wanted to set the record straight." She smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did what you had to do. Besides, maybe this will encourage people to think twice before throwing accusations around." Leavitt nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Over the next few days, invitations poured in for him to appear on more shows, write op-eds, and even speak at conferences. Suddenly, he found himself thrust into the national spotlight, a role he hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. As he navigated this new reality, Leavitt stuck to his principles. On every platform he appeared on, he emphasized the importance of civility and accuracy in political discussions. "We're all guilty of oversimplifying complex issues sometimes," he told one interviewer. "But if we want to move forward as a country, we need to focus less on scoring points and more on finding solutions." His message resonated with many Americans who were tired of the constant bickering and finger-pointing. Polls showed growing support for leaders who prioritize substance over spectacle. Even some of Carville's longtime fans admitted that Leavitt's approach had merit. "I don't agree with everything he says," one viewer commented online, "but I appreciate that he's trying to elevate the conversation." Back in Louisiana, Carville was doing some soul-searching of his own. He spent hours reviewing Leavitt's arguments, analyzing where he might have gone wrong. Friends close to him noticed a shift in his demeanor. He was quieter, more reflective. One evening, over dinner with his family, he admitted, "Maybe I underestimated the guy. He's smarter than I gave him credit for." This realization marked a turning point for Carville. Instead of doubling down on his original stance, he began reaching out to colleagues and experts, seeking their input on how to refine his arguments. He also started paying closer attention to the data, recognizing that emotions alone weren't enough to sway public opinion. Slowly but surely, he began preparing for a comeback, one that would require humility as much as conviction. While both men prepared for their next moves, the public remained captivated by their evolving dynamic. Would Carville regain his footing, or would Leavitt continue to dominate the narrative? The answer lay somewhere in between, as neither man was willing to back down entirely. What started as a heated exchange had transformed into something bigger, a test of whether two opposing voices could find common ground without sacrificing their core beliefs. And so, the stage was set for the next chapter in this unexpected saga. With tensions high and stakes even higher, the world waited to see what would happen next. The momentum around Michael Leavitt continued to build, and it wasn't long before he became a fixture in the media landscape. Every network wanted a piece of him. Morning shows, primetime debates, podcasts, you name it, they were calling. At first, Leavitt tried to keep his appearances limited, fearing that too much exposure might dilute his message. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that people weren't just interested in what he had to say about James Carville or the Trumps. They were drawn to his approach. Calm, factual, and respectful, that's what stood out most. One afternoon, Leavitt appeared on a popular daytime talk show hosted by a well-known journalist. The host introduced him warmly, saying, "You've really struck a chord with viewers, Michael. People are saying you're bringing civility back to political discussions. What's your secret?" Leavitt chuckled softly, adjusting his tie as he leaned forward. "I don't think there's a secret," he replied. "It's pretty simple, actually. I believe we can disagree without being disagreeable. You don't have to raise your voice or insult someone to make a point. Just lay out the facts, explain your perspective, and let people decide for themselves." The audience nodded along, clearly appreciating his philosophy. But then came the inevitable question. What about James Carville? Do you think he's learned anything from this whole exchange? Leavitt paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think James is a smart guy," he said diplomatically. "He's been in this game a long time and he knows how to provoke reactions. That's his style and it works for him. But I also think he understands that facts matter. If anything, maybe this has reminded all of us, including me, that no one has a monopoly on truth. We should always be open to learning, even when it's uncomfortable." His answer earned applause from the crowd, but behind the scenes, the tension between him and Carville was far from resolved. Back in Louisiana, Carville was still processing everything that had happened. He'd spent decades building a reputation as a fearless debater, someone who could hold their own against anyone. Being left speechless, even momentarily, wasn't something he took lightly. Friends noticed that he seemed quieter these days, spending hours alone in his office poring over notes and transcripts. One evening, after another round of interviews, Carville decided to call an old friend, a fellow strategist who had seen him through countless battles. They met at a small cafe in Baton Rouge, sitting at a corner table away from prying eyes. Over coffee, Carville opened up. "This thing, with Leavitt, it's got under my skin," he admitted, stirring sugar into his cup absent-mindedly. "I'm not used to feeling like I'm on the defensive." His friend listened patiently, nodding occasionally. When Carville finished, he leaned back and said, "Maybe it's not such a bad thing. Sometimes getting knocked off balance forces you to rethink things. Have you ever thought about sitting down with him, face to face?" Carville frowned, shaking his head. "Why would I do that? So he can lecture me about civility while I sit there looking like an idiot?" "No," his friend countered firmly. "So you can show people that two people with different views can still have a real conversation. Think about it. Imagine the headlines if you two actually agreed to hash this out together. It wouldn't just be good for you. It could be good for everyone." For a moment, Carville didn't say anything. He stared out the window, watching cars pass by on the busy street. Finally, he sighed and said, "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's worth a shot." Word of Carville's potential interest in reconciliation quickly spread, thanks in part to his friend discreetly floating the idea to a few trusted contacts in the media. Within hours, speculation was rampant. Social media lit up with posts debating whether the two men would actually meet. Some dismissed it as a publicity stunt, while others hoped it might signal a turning point in political discourse. Leavitt, meanwhile, remained cautious. When reporters asked him about the possibility of a joint appearance, he kept his responses measured. "I'm always open to having honest conversations," he told one interviewer. "But it has to be about more than just scoring points or generating clicks. If we're going to do this, it needs to be meaningful." Despite his reservations, Leavitt couldn't deny that the idea intrigued him. Like Carville, he saw an opportunity, not just to defend his arguments, but to model a better way of engaging with opponents. After consulting with his team, he agreed to explore the possibility further. A neutral moderator was suggested, someone respected by both sides, and initial talks began quietly. As details slowly emerged, anticipation reached a fever pitch. Viewers tuned in eagerly to see updates, hungry for any hint of what might happen next. Late-night comedians joked about the hypothetical showdown, imagining scenarios ranging from fiery arguments to awkward handshakes. Even political analysts weighed in, speculating on how each man would handle the pressure. Finally, after weeks of negotiations, it was announced James Carville and Michael Leavitt would appear together on a live broadcast, moderated by a veteran journalist known for her ability to keep discussions focused and fair. The event was billed as a conversation, not a debate, with the goal of fostering understanding rather than fueling division. When the day arrived, millions of Americans tuned in, curious to see how it would unfold. Both men walked onto the stage separately, greeted by polite applause. Carville wore his trademark confident grin, though there was a hint of nervousness in his eyes. Leavitt, ever composed, offered a warm smile as he took his seat. For a brief moment, they exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the weight of the moment. The moderator opened with a simple question. "Why did you agree to this?" Carville went first, leaning forward slightly. "Because sometimes you've got to step outside your comfort zone," he said, his tone softer than usual. "I may not agree with everything Michael says, but I respect his willingness to engage. And honestly, I think we owe it to people to show that it's possible to disagree without tearing each other apart." Leavitt nodded, adding, "For me, it's about proving that civility isn't weakness. We can challenge each other's ideas without resorting to personal attacks. If we can model that here today, maybe it'll inspire others to do the same." With those opening remarks, the tone was set. What followed was a spirited yet respectful exchange, filled with moments of tension, humor, and even surprising agreement. By the end of the hour, neither man had changed the other's mind, but both had gained a deeper appreciation for the value of listening. As they shook hands and thanked the moderator, the audience erupted in applause. For the first time in a long time, it felt like progress, not perfection, but progress. And in today's world, that was enough. The live broadcast had ended, but the conversation between James Carville and Michael Leavitt was far from over. As soon as the cameras turned off, both men lingered on stage for a few extra minutes, exchanging thoughts they hadn't been able to fit into the structured format of the show. The moderator stepped aside, giving them space to talk privately. It wasn't rehearsed or planned. It felt genuine, almost like two old friends catching up after years apart. Carville leaned against the edge of the table, his usual bravado softened by an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "You know," he said, with a small laugh, "I didn't think I'd walk away from this liking you as much as I do." Leavitt smiled faintly, tucking his hands into his pockets. "Same here. I expected fireworks, not, well, this." Their moment of connection didn't go unnoticed. A camera crew lingered just long enough to capture the exchange before being politely ushered away by producers. Within hours, clips of their post-show interactions surfaced online, sparking even more discussion. People were amazed, not just by what they had said during the broadcast, but by how naturally respectful they seemed afterward. For many viewers, it was proof that civility wasn't dead. It just needed room to breathe. Over the next few days, the ripple effects of their meeting spread far beyond politics. Talk shows dedicated entire segments to analyzing the event, praising its tone and substance. Social media buzzed with hashtags like civility wins and respectful discourse, as people shared stories of times when honest conversations had bridged divides in their own lives. Even late-night comedians, who usually thrived on mocking political drama, found themselves applauding the effort. One joked, "If these two can sit down without throwing chairs, maybe there's hope for the rest of us." But while the public celebrated the moment, behind the scenes, things weren't quite so simple. Both Carville and Leavitt faced pushback from their respective corners. Hardcore supporters accused Carville of going soft, questioning why he'd agreed to share a platform with someone defending figures he'd spent years criticizing. On the other side, some conservatives dismissed Leavitt as naive, arguing that civility was a luxury the opposition wouldn't extend if given the chance. For Carville, the criticism stung. He prided himself on being a fighter, someone who never backed down from a challenge. Sitting in his home office one evening, he scrolled through angry tweets directed at him, feeling torn. Part of him wanted to fire back, to remind everyone that he hadn't compromised his principles. He'd simply chosen a different way to fight. But another part of him wondered if maybe, just maybe, his critics were missing the point. He picked up the phone and called his wife, who often served as his sounding board. "What do you think?" he asked her after venting about the backlash. "Am I losing my edge here?" She laughed softly, knowing exactly how to calm him down. "James, your edge is what makes you who you are. But sometimes, even the sharpest tools need a little polish. Did you feel like you betrayed yourself out there?" "No," he admitted. "Not really. I still believe everything I said. I don't know. Maybe I'm tired of all the noise." Her response was simple but powerful. Then change the tune. Meanwhile, Leavitt was navigating his own challenges. Back in Virginia, he received calls from colleagues urging him to capitalize on his newfound fame. Some suggested writing a book. Others proposed launching a podcast or even running for office. While flattered, Leavitt hesitated. He didn't want to come across as opportunistic, using the moment for personal gain. Instead, he focused on continuing the work he'd always done, quietly shaping policies and encouraging thoughtful dialogue. Still, he couldn't ignore the impact of what had happened. People now recognized him at grocery stores and coffee shops, stopping to thank him for standing up for civility. One woman approached him outside a bookstore, tears in her eyes. "My husband and I have been arguing nonstop about politics," she confessed. "Watching you and Mr. Carville gave me hope that we can find a way to talk again." Leavitt listened intently, touched by her words. "Thank you for sharing that," he replied sincerely. "It means a lot to hear it made a difference." As weeks passed, the initial frenzy began to die down, replaced by quieter reflections. Carville returned to his regular appearances, though something about his delivery had shifted. He still brought passion and energy to every debate, but there was a new layer of thoughtfulness beneath the surface. He started asking tougher questions, not just of others, but of himself. Was he truly listening, or just waiting for his turn to speak? Was he challenging ideas or attacking people? Leavitt, too, noticed subtle changes in his own approach. He became more intentional about seeking out diverse perspectives, recognizing that understanding didn't mean agreement. During interviews, he emphasized the importance of finding common ground, even when differences remained. "We're all human," he told one audience, "and at the end of the day, that matters more than any policy or ideology." Their paths crossed again a few months later, this time at a charity gala in Washington, D.C. Both men were honored for their contributions to public discourse, an ironic twist considering how differently they viewed the world. When they spotted each other across the crowded room, they exchanged a knowing smile. Later during dinner, they ended up seated next to each other, a decision organizers swore was coincidental. Throughout the evening, they chatted casually, steering clear of controversial topics. Instead, they talked about family, hobbies, and shared frustrations with modern media. By the time dessert arrived, it was clear their bond had deepened. They weren't friends in the traditional sense, but they had earned each other's respect, a rare commodity in today's polarized climate. The night wound down. Carville raised his glass in a toast. "To disagreeing better," he said with a wry grin. Leavitt chuckled, clinking his glass against Carville's. "And to proving that it's possible." The room erupted in applause, unaware of the weight those words carried. In that moment, amidst the glitz and glamour of a high-profile event, two men who once stood on opposite sides demonstrated something profound. Progress doesn't require perfection. It requires patience, humility, and a willingness to meet halfway, even when it feels impossible. And as the crowd cheered, one thing became crystal clear. This story wasn't just about James Carville or Michael Leavitt. It was about all of us, the choices we make, the bridges we build, and the hope that keeps us moving forward, one conversation at a time. The weeks following the charity gala brought an unexpected twist to the evolving relationship between James Carville and Michael Leavitt. What began as a heated exchange over immigration policy had transformed into something neither man could have predicted, a genuine, albeit cautious, respect for one another. But this newfound connection wasn't without its challenges. Both men quickly realized that their willingness to engage in thoughtful dialogue didn't shield them from criticism. In fact, it seemed to amplify it. For Carville, the backlash came mostly from within his own camp. Hardcore Democrats accused him of going soft or pandering to the other side. Some even suggested he was betraying the very principles he'd spent decades championing. One particularly scathing op-ed titled, "Has James Carville Lost His Edge?" argued that his recent interactions with Leavitt undermined the urgency of holding political figures accountable. The piece went viral, sparking heated debates across social media. Carville read the article late one night, sitting alone in his study with a glass of bourbon. He felt the weight of every word, not because they were untrue, but because they struck a nerve. Was he compromising his values by choosing civility over confrontation? Or was he simply adapting to a world where shouting matches no longer moved the needle? He decided to address the criticism head-on during a live radio interview the next morning. When the host asked about the backlash, Carville leaned closer to the microphone, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Look," he said, "I get it. People expect me to come out swinging every time I open my mouth. And trust me, I still will when it's necessary. But here's the thing. Sometimes the best way to fight is by showing up differently. If we're always yelling, always attacking, then nothing changes. We just keep digging the same old trenches." His words resonated with some listeners, especially those who had grown weary of divisive rhetoric. Others remained skeptical, accusing him of using civility as a cover for weakness. Still, Carville refused to backpedal. Instead, he doubled down on his belief that progress required more than just winning arguments. It required building bridges. Leavitt faced a different kind of pushback. While conservatives generally praised his ability to counter Carville's accusations, Many felt uneasy about his growing prominence. Some saw him as a threat, worried that his moderate tone might dilute the party's message. Others accused him of seeking personal glory, pointing to his increased media appearances and public speaking engagements as evidence of self-promotion. At first, Leavitt tried to ignore the criticism, focusing instead on the work he cared about most, helping craft policies that balanced principle with pragmatism. But the negativity eventually wore on him. During a quiet moment at home, he confided in his wife. "It's like no matter what I do, someone's going to be mad," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "If I stay quiet, they call me irrelevant. If I speak up, they say I'm grandstanding." She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You can't control what people think," she reminded him gently. "All you can do is stay true to yourself. If you believe in what you're doing, then let that be enough." Her advice stuck with him. Over the next few days, Leavitt made a conscious decision to tune out the noise and focus on why he'd entered politics in the first place: to make a difference. He began reaching out to colleagues on both sides of the aisle, proposing collaborative efforts on issues like healthcare reform and criminal justice. To his surprise, many were receptive. It seemed that the example he and Carville had set was inspiring others to take similar steps. As summer approached, the two men found themselves crossing paths again, not by design, but by coincidence. They were invited to separate panels at a bipartisan conference in Chicago, organized by a group dedicated to fostering cooperation across political lines. Though their sessions were scheduled hours apart, attendees buzzed with excitement at the prospect of seeing them interact once. More sure enough, fate intervened. During a coffee break between panels, Carville and Leavitt bumped into each other near the refreshment table. For a moment, they stood awkwardly, unsure whether to acknowledge the elephant in the room. Then Carville broke the ice with a grin. "Well, looks like we're stuck together again." Leavitt laughed, shaking his head. "Guess great minds, or stubborn ones, think alike." They ended up sitting together on a bench outside the convention center, sipping lukewarm coffee and chatting casually. This time, their conversation turned toward practical solutions rather than philosophical musings. Carville mentioned a grassroots campaign he was supporting to improve access to affordable housing. Leavitt shared details about a pilot program aimed at reducing recidivism rates among former inmates. By the end of their impromptu meeting, they had exchanged contact information and agreed to stay in touch. It wasn't groundbreaking or headline-worthy, but it was meaningful. They weren't trying to solve all of America's problems in one afternoon. They were simply planting seeds, hoping they might grow into something bigger. Back inside the conference hall, rumors of their benchside chat spread quickly. Attendees whispered excitedly, speculating about what it meant. Some hoped it signaled a new era of collaboration. Others dismissed it as mere politicking. Regardless of interpretations, one thing was undeniable: the image of two longtime adversaries sharing ideas and laughs was powerful. When the conference wrapped up, organizers invited Carville and Leavitt to deliver closing remarks together. Standing side by side on stage, they reflected on the lessons they'd learned over the past few months. Carville spoke first, his tone unusually reflective. "We don't agree on everything. In fact, we disagree on a lot. But here's the deal. Disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect. You can challenge someone's ideas without tearing them down. And sometimes if you listen closely enough, you might even learn something." Leavitt nodded, adding, "It's easy to point fingers and assign blame, but it takes courage to roll up your sleeves and work toward solutions. That's what we need more of, not just in politics, but in life." Their comments earned a standing ovation, underscoring the hunger for unity in a divided world. As they left the stage, handshakes and hugs replaced boos and jeers. People queued up to thank them, sharing stories of how their unlikely partnership had inspired hope. In the days that followed, media coverage focused less on their differences and more on their shared commitment to finding common ground. Analysts marveled at how two men with such contrasting styles and beliefs had managed to forge a connection rooted in mutual respect. Even skeptics admitted that their dynamic offered a glimmer of possibility in an otherwise bleak landscape. But Perhaps the most telling sign of change came not from pundits or politicians, but from ordinary citizens. Across the country, people began organizing community forums modeled after the principles Carville and Leavitt had demonstrated: openness, honesty, and a willingness to engage despite disagreements. From small towns to major cities, these gatherings became safe spaces for dialogue, proving that civility wasn't just a slogan, it was a practice. And so, as summer gave way to fall, the story of James Carville and Michael Leavitt continued to unfold. It wasn't perfect, nor was it finished, but it served as a reminder that even in the messiest, most contentious moments, there's always room for growth, if we're brave enough to embrace it. By the time autumn rolled around, the unlikely connection between James Carville and Michael Leavitt had started to feel less like a fleeting moment and more like the beginning of something meaningful. The two men hadn't planned on becoming symbols of civility in politics. They were just trying to navigate their own beliefs while staying true to themselves. But as they continued to interact, both publicly and privately, it became clear that their efforts were resonating with people in ways neither had anticipated. One crisp October morning, Carville found himself at a local diner in Baton Rouge, sipping black coffee and flipping through a stack of newspapers. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, emails from supporters, messages from colleagues, and tweets praising his recent appearances alongside Leavitt. At first, he'd been hesitant about this newfound role as a bridge builder. After all, he was known for being combative, not conciliatory. Yet somewhere along the way, he'd realized that sticking to your principles didn't mean refusing to evolve. Sometimes growth looked like letting go of old habits, even ones that had defined you for decades. As he scrolled through social media, one post caught his eye. It was from a young woman who had attended one of the community forums inspired by Carville and Leavitt's example. She wrote about how her town had been bitterly divided over a proposed school funding plan. For months, neighbors had argued until tempers flared and relationships soured. Then someone suggested hosting a forum where everyone could voice their concerns without fear of judgment or interruption. By the end of the evening, they hadn't solved every issue, but they had agreed to keep talking and listening. Carville stared at the screen, feeling an unfamiliar lump in his throat. He'd spent so much of his career focused on winning debates and influencing policies that he rarely stopped to think about the human side of it all. The families, the communities, the everyday lives affected by decisions made in boardrooms and on cable news shows. Maybe, he thought, there was more value in planting seeds than scoring points. Meanwhile, Michael Leavitt was grappling with his own reflections. Back in Virginia, he sat on his porch, watching leaves swirl in the wind as he thumbed through notes from recent meetings. Over the past few months, he'd worked tirelessly to foster collaboration across party lines, often finding himself frustrated by the stubbornness of others. Some lawmakers refused to budge, clinging to ideological purity, even when compromise seemed within reach. Others dismissed his ideas outright, labeling him too moderate or idealistic. But despite the setbacks, Leavitt couldn't deny the progress they'd made. A bipartisan task force he helped organize had successfully passed legislation addressing opioid addiction, a crisis that had devastated countless families nationwide. The victory wasn't glamorous. There were no press conferences or photo ops. Instead, it came quietly, almost unnoticed, tucked away in the fine print of a larger bill. Still, it mattered, and it reminded Leavitt why he kept showing up day after day, even when it felt like no one was paying attention. That evening, Leavitt received an email from an unexpected source, James Carville. The subject line read simply, "Thought you might like this." Attached was a link to a video clip of a high school debate team practicing for an upcoming tournament. In the footage, students took turns presenting arguments on controversial topics, challenging each other respectfully while maintaining open body language and attentive expressions. What struck Leavitt most was how natural it seemed for them. Like civil discourse was second nature, not something they had to fight for. Curious, Leavitt replied, "Where did you find this?" Carville responded quickly, "Saw it on Twitter, earlier today. Made me think about what we've been doing. If kids can figure it out, maybe there's hope for us old-timers." Leavitt chuckled, typing back, "Agreed." Let's make sure we leave them something worth building on. Their exchange sparked an idea. Over the next few weeks, the two men began discussing ways to support initiatives aimed at teaching younger generations the importance of respectful dialogue. They envisioned workshops, mentorship programs, and even online resources designed to equip students with tools for navigating disagreement constructively. It wasn't flashy or groundbreaking, but it was practical, and it aligned perfectly with their shared vision of fostering understanding over division. Word of their plans leaked to the press, prompting another wave of media coverage. Reporters scrambled to interview them, eager to learn more about this latest venture. During one joint appearance, a journalist asked point-blank, "Do you really believe this will make a difference? Or is it just wishful thinking?" Carville answered first, leaning forward with characteristic intensity. "Let me tell you something," he said. "Wishful thinking doesn't get results. We're not naive enough to think this is going to fix everything overnight. But if we can teach even a handful of people how to disagree without tearing each other apart, then yeah, it makes a difference." Leavitt nodded, adding, "And it's not just about changing minds. It's about reminding people that we're all in this together. Whether we like it or not, we share this country, this planet. Sooner or later, we have to figure out how to coexist." Their response earned nods of approval from viewers, many of whom expressed gratitude for leaders willing to prioritize humanity over headlines. Slowly but surely, the narrative shifted. Conversations moved beyond political affiliation to focus on universal values: empathy, patience, humility. Even critics softened their tone, acknowledging that perhaps Carville and Leavitt weren't wasting their time after all. As November approached, the pair embarked on a small speaking tour, visiting universities and community centers across the country. Their presentations combined humor, personal anecdotes, and actionable advice, leaving audiences inspired and empowered. One attendee described it as watching history unfold, not because they're famous, but because they're real. After one particularly memorable event in Ohio, a middle-aged man approached them during the Q&A session. Holding back tears, he thanked them for modeling behavior he desperately wanted to emulate. "My brother and I haven't spoken in years because of politics," he confessed. "Tonight, I'm going to call him. Maybe we won't agree on everything, but I miss him. That's what matters." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Carville and Leavitt exchanged a glance, both visibly moved. Moments like these reminded them why they kept pushing forward, even when it felt like swimming against the tide. By the time December arrived, the impact of their partnership had rippled far beyond anything they'd imagined. Community forums had sprung up in dozens of cities, drawing participants from diverse backgrounds united by a desire for connection. Social media campaigns promoting kindness and respect gained traction, fueled by hashtags like Carville and Listen First and Disagree Better. Even politicians notorious for their reluctance to embrace bipartisanship started citing Carville and Leavitt's example during speeches. Through it all, the two men remained grounded, aware that their work was far from finished. They knew change wouldn't happen overnight or even in their lifetimes, but they also knew that every conversation, every handshake, every shared laugh brought them closer to a future where civility wasn't the exception. It was the norm. And so, as snow began to blanket the ground and holiday lights twinkled in windows, James Carville and Michael Leavitt paused to reflect on the journey thus far. Neither had set out to redefine political discourse, yet here they were, standing shoulder to shoulder, proving that even the unlikeliest alliances could spark hope in dark times. As the year drew to a close, James Carville and Michael Leavitt found themselves in an unexpected position. They were no longer just political figures or strategists. They had become symbols of hope for people who believed that finding common ground was still possible in a world increasingly defined by division. The journey that began with heated accusations and sharp rebuttals had transformed into something far greater, a testament to the power of listening, learning, and growing together. One chilly December evening, the two men sat across from each other at a small cafe in Washington, D.C., their breath visible as they walked in from the cold. It wasn't planned, neither had known the other would be there, but when they spotted each other through the fogged-up window, it felt like fate stepping in once again. They grabbed coffee and slid into a corner booth, the kind of place where conversations felt safe and unhurried. For a while, they talked about everything but politics. They shared stories about holiday traditions, family quirks, and favorite childhood memories. Carville joked about his wife's obsession with gardening, while Leavitt laughed about how his kids teased him for using outdated slang. These moments reminded them that beneath all the labels, Democrat, Republican, strategist, they were simply human beings trying to make sense of life. But eventually, the conversation turned back to the work they'd been doing. "You ever stop and think about how weird this whole thing is?" Carville asked, stirring sugar into his cup. "I mean, look at us. A year ago, we couldn't stand being in the same room without throwing jabs." Leavitt smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, I've thought about it, but you know what's even weirder? How much easier it feels now. Like maybe we were both so focused on proving our points that we forgot why we cared in the first place." Carville nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's the thing, isn't it? We get so caught up in winning arguments that we lose sight of what really matters. The people. The families, the communities, the folks who just want to live their lives without feeling like the world's falling apart around them." Their words echoed themes they'd discussed countless times before, but tonight, they carried extra weight. Perhaps it was the quiet intimacy of the cafe, or maybe it was the realization that another year was ending, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. Whatever the reason, both men seemed acutely aware of how far they'd come, and how much further they still had to go. The next day, they received an invitation neither could have predicted, a request to co-author an op-ed for a major newspaper, reflecting on the past year and offering thoughts for the future. At first they hesitated, unsure if putting pen to paper together would feel forced or artificial. But after some deliberation they agreed, deciding to approach it not as rivals but as partners in a shared mission. What emerged was a piece unlike anything either had written before. Titled, "Finding Common Ground in Uncommon Times," it combined their unique perspectives into a cohesive message about the importance of empathy, humility, and resilience. "Politics doesn't have to be a zero-sum game," they wrote. "When we reduce every issue to winners and losers, we forget that everyone loses when cooperation breaks down. That doesn't mean abandoning your principles. It means finding ways to advocate for them without dehumanizing those who disagree." They went on to share personal lessons learned over the past year, emphasizing that growth often requires discomfort. "We won't pretend we agree on everything," they admitted. "In fact, we probably never will. But what we've discovered is that disagreement doesn't have to divide us. Sometimes it can bring us closer if we let it." The op-ed struck a chord with readers, many of whom described it as a beacon of optimism in uncertain times. Letters poured in from across the country, thanking Carville and Leavitt for reminding people of their shared humanity. One note stood out. A teacher wrote about using the article in her classroom to spark discussions about respectful dialogue. "My students said they finally understood what it means to disagree without hating each other," she explained. "Thank you for giving them a model to follow." Encouraged by the response, the pair decided to take their efforts one step further. On New Year's Eve, they appeared together on a prime-time special dedicated to reflecting on the year's biggest moments. As fireworks lit up skies around the globe, they sat side by side, sharing insights gleaned from their unlikely partnership. "When I look back on 2023, Carville said, his voice warm despite the chill of the studio air, "I don't see failure or success, I see progress. And progress doesn't always look perfect. It's messy, unpredictable, sometimes painful, but it moves us forward." Leavitt chimed in, his tone equally reflective. "I think what we've learned is that change starts small. It's not about grand gestures or sweeping reforms overnight. It's about showing up, day after day, willing to listen and learn. If enough people do that, imagine what we can accomplish." Their words resonated deeply with viewers, many of whom stayed up late into the night discussing the interview with friends and family. Social media buzzed with reflections on the year ahead, fueled by a renewed sense of possibility. Cars, like Progress Not Perfection, trended worldwide, capturing the collective desire for a brighter future. As midnight approached, Carville and Leavitt stood outside the studio, bundled in coats against the winter wind. Fireworks exploded overhead, painting the sky in bursts of color. For a moment they watched in silence, taking it all in. "You know," Leavitt said finally, breaking the quiet, "if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be ringing in the new year with you, I wouldn't have believed them." Carville chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Same here. Guess miracles do happen." They shook hands, then lingered a little longer, savoring the moment. Neither knew exactly what the coming year would hold, but they were certain of one thing. Whatever happened, they'd face it together. Not as enemies, but as allies in the ongoing fight for understanding. And as the clock struck 12, marking the start of a new chapter, millions of people tuned in to watch, not just to celebrate the end of another year, but to witness the beginning of something bigger, something better, something built on the simple yet profound idea that even in a divided world, connection is always possible, if we're brave enough to reach out.